All right, get ready to dive deep because we're taking on Kant, specifically his critique of practical reason. We're going to break down some of his ideas with, of course, help from the amazing translator's intro to this edition.
And I think what we'll find is that, Kant, he wasn't just trying to tell everyone what's right and wrong like some philosophers. It was like he was really trying to take apart the whole idea of moral reasoning,
Yeah.
figure out how it works.
I like that. Yeah, like he was reverse engineering morality.
Exactly.
But before we get too far into it, maybe we should set the stage a bit. The translator reminds us that Kant, he wasn't just writing, in a bubble, right? It was the 1700s, the Reformation had just happened, and people were really searching for a way to think about morality that wasn't only based on religion.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, imagine the environment at that time, right? Philosophers like Leibniz and Hume, they were wrestling with this exact thing. Can you have morality in a world that's increasingly focused on reason and science? And Kant, well, he tries to find an answer. And he uses this really interesting critical approach to do it.
And that's always a word I get hung up on. Critical.
Right, and it can mean so many things.
Yeah.
He's not like criticizing morality in the normal sense. It's more like he's saying, okay, let's stop for a second. Forget what we think we know about good and bad. What if we could break down this whole morality system? See what makes it work, if it even works at all.
So instead of like a car mechanic, he's a morality mechanic.
Exactly. He's all about finding those core principles, trying to figure out what makes morality tick. And that leads to his, well, it's probably his most famous idea, the categorical imperative.
See, now that's where I have to put on my monocle and stroke my beard. The categorical imperative. It just sounds so, I don't know, imposing.
It does, right. But when you really get down to it, it's kind of a test for your actions, Kant says like this: act only according to that maxim whereby you can at the same time will through that it should become a universal law.
Okay, so break that down a little because that sounds pretty dense.
It means, basically, before you do something, you got to ask, would it be cool if everybody did this?
Yeah.
Like, let's say you're thinking about, I don't know, taking a cookie from the cookie jar when you're not supposed to.
Oh, I'd never.
Of course not. But would you want a world where everybody just took cookies whenever they felt like it? Probably not.
Right. Chaos.
Right. Exactly.
Yeah.
The categorical imperative, it's about saying your actions should be something you could turn into a rule for everybody without things going haywire.
So it's like that golden rule thing, but, with more philosophy.
Exactly.
What makes this so important to Kant, though?
It goes back to what he thought was the only good thing in itself, a good will. He wasn't so worried about what happens because of what you do, like if you get that cookie or not. It was more about why you were doing it.
So it's the intention behind the action that matters.
Yeah, the intention, the will, that's the heart of it for him. Like if someone tripped and fell and accidentally, I don't know, donated to charity or something.
A very clumsy person.
Right, Kant wouldn't be impressed. Because it wasn't intentional. It was an accident.
It's not about the charity. It's about the thought that counts.
Exactly. And it makes you wonder, did this idea of a good will come from Plato? Because Plato had that whole idea of practical wisdom, this like inner moral compass. And I feel like Kant maybe took that and ran with it.
It's like Kant took Plato's greatest hits and, remixed them for a new generation. But we can't forget about freedom. That was huge for him.
Oh, absolutely. And this is where things get really, really interesting. So, most people, when they think about freedom, they think about like not having restrictions. Right. Being able to just do whatever they want.
Right. No rules.
Exactly. But Kant, he flips that whole idea on his head. He's like, nope, true freedom is about following laws. But not just any laws. Laws you give yourself. Laws that come from reason, not just, your desires at any given moment.
So not about just doing whatever feels good.
Exactly. And that's where we loop back to the categorical imperative. If you're always just following those impulses, you're not really free. You're kind of a slave to what you want in that moment. Yeah. True freedom for Kant was about like using your reason and acting in a way that everyone could.
So I was thinking about it like driving a car, right? You're behind the wheel, you decide where you go versus being a passenger where you just got to go wherever.
Perfect analogy.
Yeah.
And this idea that freedom is about making your own rules, it was a big deal back then, especially with empiricism becoming popular. And that was the idea that, we're all just products of our experiences.
That we're like programmed by the world around us.
Right, exactly. But Kant, he pushes back on that. He says, no, we can be more than that. We can make choices based on reason, not just because of what we've experienced.
We have the ability to break free, basically.
Exactly. We can make our own choices. And that's what makes us moral beings, according to Kant. But then, of course, that leads to the big question, what about happiness?
Right, because Kant is known for being all about duty,
Yeah.
like, do your duty. Happiness is secondary.
It's true, he didn't think happiness was the most important thing when it came to morality. In fact, he kind of dissed those old Epicurean philosophers, the ones who were all about pleasure.
Yeah, pleasure is the goal.
Exactly.
Right.
But Kant, he didn't hate happiness. It's more like he saw it as a side effect, not the main goal. Like, if you live a good life, happiness will just happen along the way.
So it's like focus on being a good person and happiness will just like follow you around.
Something like that, yeah. He thought that true happiness came from being virtuous. When we live according to our best selves, when we use our reason, we find a kind of satisfaction, a real sense of peace that you just can't get from chasing pleasure all the time.
It's deeper than just feeling good.
Exactly. And that's why he also criticized the Stoics. Remember them. They were all about virtue, maybe even a little too much. Kant thought you need both. Being good and finding happiness. That's the ideal.
Okay, I like that. The best of both worlds. But how do we get there? How do we find that balance? Especially since, like you were saying, Kant didn't think you could just choose to be happy.
And that's where it gets really tricky. It even makes you question if reason is enough. Remember that story about the guy who would rather die than tell a lie?
Oh yeah, talk about sticking to your principles. I don't know if I could be that strong.
It shows just how much Kant believed in moral law. Even when it's hard, even when it seems impossible. This guy, he shows what it means to be guided by reason, even when everything in you is screaming to just survive.
It does make you wonder, though, are there times when your gut, your emotions should play a role? Or was Kant saying we got to shut that all down and just be logical?
It's a question philosophers are still trying to answer. It's one of those things in Kant's work that really makes you think. On the one hand, he's all about universal rules, right? Everyone should act this way. But we're also human. We feel things. Sometimes what you feel and what seems logical, they don't match up.
It's tough, right? Like, how do you choose, heart or head? But if we can't always trust our gut, and reason isn't perfect, how do we handle the situations where there's no easy answer?
Well, that's the question, isn't it? And that's where I think this idea of the highest good comes back in. The whole, virtue and happiness working together thing.
Right, that perfect combo. But we were just saying how you can't control happiness, so how does that work?
Well, you see, this is where Kant, he throws a bit of a curveball. He suggests that maybe, just maybe, to really get to that highest good, you need something more, something beyond what humans can do on their own.
Hold on, is Kant, Mr. Reason himself, saying we need, faith?
It's not that he suddenly became, a super religious guy, but he does say there's a problem. He's like, look, if we really are free and we're responsible for our choices, then shouldn't we be able to reach that highest good? But we both know in this life, it doesn't always work like that. Good people have a hard time. Bad people get away with stuff. It doesn't always feel fair.
Yeah, no, I've definitely been there. So how does he explain that, if he's all about being moral?
He brings in this idea of God and an afterlife. Not because it's like religious dogma, but because he thinks it has to be true for morality to actually make sense.
Okay, so just to be clear, Kant, who built his whole philosophy on reason, is saying we have to at least consider something beyond reason for morality to work out.
Kind of, yeah. He's basically arguing that if we're supposed to follow this moral law, if we should be striving for that highest good, there needs to be something else, some way for it all to balance out, some place where being good pays off,
Like a cosmic reset button.
Exactly, where everything gets set right.
So it's almost like he's saying that reason, when you take it as far as it can go, it points to something bigger than itself.
Yeah, I think that's a really good way to put it. Kant knew that humans can't understand everything. And even though he spent his life figuring out the power of reason, he knew there were still mysteries out there.
It's kind of humbling, isn't it? Kant tells us to use our brains, to try to be our best selves. But he also says it's okay to admit there's stuff we just don't know.
Exactly. And that's probably why people are still reading him today.
Yeah.
His work, it makes you think hard, but it also makes you appreciate those big questions, the ones we might not ever have the answers to.
Well, we definitely got our mental workout in today. We went from basic morality all the way to, well, the cosmos. And just like Kant, we're going to leave you with a little something to ponder. If our moral compass is guided by reason, but also by our experiences, by those big rules in our own lives, how do we deal with those tough choices, the ones where there's no easy answer, no categorical imperative, something to think about until our next deep dive?